I'm Ramon, and this is the For Real News on the Bold Like a Leopard channel. This year around the world, media commemorated the October Revolution in Russia. The Soviet Union emerged out of a feudal empire ruled by an absolute monarch, Tsar Nikolai II, who was detached from the everyday lives of his citizens at the most inopportune time. During a massive world conflict in which his nation lost over 3 million people, military and civilian. The Soviet Union endeavored to be the nation that would address all of the social wrongs of its predecessor by instituting a classless society, the quote-unquote dictatorship of the proletariat. However, unlike Marx and Engels, its founder Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Lenin, argued that this concept, which involved the withering away of the state, was mainly directed toward filtering out anarchists and bourgeoisie and was not meant to mean the proletarian state withering away. For those of you that have no patience for the details, Lenin believed ultimately that a massive state authority was necessary and never sought to return decisions to local community levels. We will now examine how Abby Martin of Venezuela's Telesur analyzes the Russian Revolution along with Brian Becker. Although they are here discussing Red October, a more apt name for what's going on here would be White Lies. As always, you may view the original video in the description below and compare the full version to my interpretation.
2017 marks the centennial of one of the biggest events in human history. 100 years ago, a huge chunk of the planet became ruled by workers and peasants with a socialist economy, with the success of the Russian Revolution. 14 other nations joined Russia into what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, shifting a balance of power in a world that had long been dominated.
You should be aware that already here Abby Martin is lying by omission about the nature of the Soviet Union. You can see, if you look at the extreme left side of the page, you see the nations of the Baltic region, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Those three states did not join the Soviet Union until they were conquered by it prior to World War II, during a pact between Stalin and Hitler. So the idea that they voluntarily joined the Soviet Union is a bald-faced lie that can never stand the test of time. They never voluntarily joined the Soviet Union, whether it was in 1917 or 1921 when the Civil War ended, or before World War II, or even after World War II. It was always a coercive relationship between the Soviet Union and the Baltic states.
To learn more about this event, I sat down with Brian Becker, longtime socialist organizer and co-author of the new book Storming the Gates: How the Russian Revolution Changed the World. So can you set the stage for the revolution in Russia in 1917 and what was happening both locally and globally that sparked it?
Well, the big context, the big picture for the Russian Revolution was a country that spanned all the way from Poland to the Pacific.
Here we come to a major conflict of interest in the interview. Abby Martin is not sitting only across the aisle from a person knowledgeable about the Russian Revolution. If you look at the Twitter page of Brian Becker, it says that he is the leader of the Answer Coalition, one of the main anti-war groups during the Iraq War, which is understandable. That's not anything to be ashamed of, but he also says he's the founder of the PSL. What is the PSL? The Party of Socialism and Liberation, one of the numerous communist parties operating in the United States that don't really have a central group or a central leadership to follow. So why is that a conflict of interest? Perhaps they just have an ideological commonality between Martin and Becker. If you go to Popular Resistance, one of the PSL pages pertaining to a forum on Venezuela in June, it says, on June 2nd, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or the PSL, held a forum in Los Angeles featuring PSL member Mike Prisner, underlined in blue, who gave an eyewitness report on his recent trip to Venezuela. The event was a solidarity event supporting the Bolivarian Revolution against the attacks by the Venezuelan right wing, attacks which have included racist self-proclaimed lynchings carried out by ultra-rightist elements of the Venezuelan opposition. Prisner and Abby Martin of Telesur's The Empire Files recently visited Venezuela to gather research and interviews for the show, which Prisner produces. So we already see here there is an element of deception where a reporter claiming to interview an expert on the Russian Revolution is talking to somebody who is a member of the same party as herself without stating that clearly on the screen or in any other part of the interview.
In Russia in 1917, and what was happening both locally and globally that sparked it?
Well, the big context, the big picture for the Russian Revolution was a country that spanned all the way from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. In other words, the largest landmass of any country in the world. A country that had been ruled by an emperor, the Tsar. For 300 years, the Romanov family dominated. In 1917, 75% of the country were peasants. 96% of the peasants were illiterate. There had been tempestuous industrial growth in the last years before the Russian Revolution as a consequence of foreign direct investment, mainly from France. But in general, this was a society that had remained static for 3 centuries. The monarchy had become decrepit. It had a bad leadership under the Tsar, the last Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II. Most importantly, the Russian Empire had suffered major military defeats in 1905 in the war with Japan, a humiliating defeat. And then in the World War I, 3 million plus Russians died. There was no end to the war. And the consequence of that was that the people in Russia could not eat. The peasants were at the front. They wanted to go home to the farms. And so economic misery and discontent was growing. The Russian Revolution, well, there were really 2 revolutions. The February Revolution started on International Women's Day when women went out on strike protesting their immiseration. And suddenly, surprisingly, within 3 or 4 days, the Tsar was vanquished. That wasn't carried out by the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks or the Social Revolutionaries or any political party. It was an entirely spontaneous mass movement that the Tsar himself, the day before the revolution, where he loses leadership, he's writing in his diary, "I took a walk today, I had tea today." In other words, a leadership that was completely removed from the realities of his own country.
This is the one area of the video where I think that Becker and Martin are doing a fairly accurate job. To describe the Russian Empire as a failure would be putting it mildly by 1917. Remember that this is a country that had numerous start and stop processes where they tried to reform society, tried to democratize society. There had been assassinations in the past that had stopped reform. And by the time Tsar Nikolai II came to power, he had decided that he will cling to any powers that the absolute monarchy could keep. He did not believe that the Duma, or the Russian parliament, should have any role in the administration of his state. So, in many ways, Russia propelled itself on the path to being overthrown in some sort of civilian upheaval because the Tsar himself imposed a totalitarian regime.
What sectors of Russian society comprised of the revolution, and what role did they play?
There were 2 basic classes. Of course, we know from the flag of the Soviet Union, it was the hammer representing the workers and the sickle representing the tool of the peasants. Those were the 2 classes. You had the urban workers in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, a few other industrial cities. But again, as I said, 75% of the country were peasants. There was a peasant uprising as a consequence of the extreme suffering caused by World War I. The Bolshevik Party, which was an urban-based, proletarian-based party, a minority party, a small party relatively in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, it threw its lot in with the peasants. It said during this period of tempestuous peasant uprising, land to the tiller. We, the workers, support the peasants in seizing the landed estates from the big landowners. And so the workers and peasants began marching step by step, shoulder and shoulder with each other, against the common enemy. First the Tsar, and later, 9 months later, against the bourgeoisie that had taken the place of the Tsar. So the bourgeois government became the next to fall. That was the October Revolution. It was a worker and peasant revolution led by a worker and peasant Soviet.
Okay, here Becker is trying to make the case, as often is done among communists, that their revolutions are done from the bottom up, from the peasantry and the workers upward, overthrowing the ruling class. What they neglect to talk about is where exactly their own leadership comes from. And we have to go person by person through the leadership of the Soviet revolutionaries and ask exactly how is it that these people came to be in power? Were these real peasants and workers, or did they come from a different sector of society? Now, let's look at Vladimir Ulyanov, or Lenin. It says, according to his biography, that his father, Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, was from a family of the serfs, which were former slaves. They were emancipated in the 1860s. However, by the time Ulyanov had grown to be mature, Ulyanov the elder, he'd already become educated in and had become middle class. In fact, he was a physics and mathematics student at Kazan Imperial University, as well as a teacher at one of the higher class colleges in Russia, the Penza Institute for the Nobility. He also married into a family of more prosperous middle class to higher middle class people. His wife was Maria Blank. So therefore, it is very doubtful that you can call him a member of this underclass. Okay, what about Leon Trotsky, or Lev Bronstein, as he was originally known as? He was born to a Ukrainian Jewish family of wealthy farmers, and they generally, in fact, they had 5 children. A lot of Russian families, I don't believe they had 5 living children. So, although he was originally from one of the underclass in Russia, the Jews were very strictly discriminated against by the Russian imperial authorities. It's not as if this is somebody who came from that great mass of serfs that the Bolsheviks were talking about liberating. So the third member of the top triumvirate of real political powers in the early Soviet Union, of course, was Joseph Stalin, or Joseph Yugachvili, who was actually born to one of the real minorities in Russia, the Georgians, or I think that they're called Gruzinskis in Russian. And he actually does fit kind of the profile of the underclass, because his dad was a abusive, raging alcoholic. His mother was this low-ranking, I think she was a cleaner. In fact, you could go look through her history. She didn't really. She worked as a house cleaner and the launderer. And basically, they were taken up by some clergymen, and as is legend, he was slated to become kind of a priest. Very ironic given what he actually ended up doing. So, if anything, the leadership of the Russian Revolution really embodied a cross-section of many of the classes in the Soviet Union, but it certainly wasn't representative of a working class.
Everybody knows the name Soviet Union, but who were the Soviets?
The Soviet is the Russian word for council. The Soviets were a little bit like what Occupy encampments were, but they were independent councils of people's power from the grassroots. So the workers' districts voted for delegates to come to the workers' council. The council is the Soviet in Russian. Same with the peasants. They had peasant councils. And the soldiers got in on the act too, and they formed Soviets of soldiers. So these were elective bodies from the grassroots resistors, who said, we have more legitimacy than the existing government. And so they became a dual power, a secondary power, a competing power with governmental power.
And what made the Russian Revolution different than, let's say, the US Revolution from its monarchy, the French Revolution from its monarchy? I mean, it ousted a czarist monarchy.
Right. Revolutions aren't very common in history, but they do happen. You mentioned the American Revolution, a revolution against a monarchy, the French Revolution that came a decade later against a monarchy. The real difference in the Russian Revolution is that it was the very first time in history where the revolution was led by classes that did not have private property at all. The working class did not have private property. They didn't own factories. They didn't own estates. If you look at the American Revolution, it was led by big plantation owners and big bankers in the northern cities. Here you had poor people, working class people, seize the power of society and say, guess what? We are going to really have a government of, by, and for the people, which was not protecting any private property interests, but in fact attacking private property, meaning the control of capital. So that's what made it really unique. The first time the working class or working classes took power and held power. There have been other worker insurrections, other peasant insurrections, but they took the power and they were able to hold it. Of course, Winston Churchill and all the Western leaders, they never thought the Russian Revolution would last more than a few months. Winston Churchill said, let's strangle that baby while it's still in the crib. And of course, that led to many multiple imperialist invasions. They never thought the Bolsheviks could hold it. They thought, oh, these are poor people. These are workers, they're peasants. How could they be the ruling class of society? But shockingly, the Bolsheviks, for the first time, showed that the working class, the poor, could actually take and hold power.
Here you see Abby Martin and Brian Becker are dancing around a real key question, which is, are all citizens equal in the Soviet democracy? And the answer is clearly not, because they're actually proud of the fact that only workers and peasants could vote in the Soviets. And why do we know that? Because what they talk only about the groups that are allowed to vote in them. They don't talk about the groups that are excluded, and those are those who employ others for profit, those who live on incomes not derived from their own work, such as interest on capital, which would be bankers, in many cases, I guess, Jews, industrial enterprises or landed property, that would be real estate owners, private businessmen, agents, middlemen, so that would be people that are involved in the non-labor economy, service employees, monks and priests of all denominations, so that would include rabbis, priests, and imams, and ex-employees of the old police services and members of the Romanov dynasty, for obvious reasons, and then lunatics and criminals. Therefore, you can't really call this a totally emancipated democracy. It's really a case where Lenin created a parallel government where only people who came from his core constituency had full voting rights.
It seems very crazy to people living here to confront the powers that be as a peasant force and not have just complete massacres. I mean, how bloody was the revolution, and how did it actually take place? Like, how did these peasants actually take power and hold it?
The February Revolution, the leadership was inherited by bourgeois liberals. They were called the Cadet Party and some socialists, Kerensky in particular. The problem that that revolutionary government that came from the February Revolution had was it could not escape its alliance with Britain, France, and the United States, which insisted that the new revolutionary government stay in World War I as allies. The US and Britain and France didn't want them to end the war because then Germany could focus all of its attentions on the Western Front. So they demanded that Kerensky and the Russian revolutionaries stay in the war. But that's what the revolution was about, getting out of the war, stopping the killing, letting the soldiers go back and work the farms. So the Bolshevik Revolution came about because the Bolsheviks and the Bolsheviks alone said, we must have a second revolution if we are to end the war. So it was an anti-war revolution. When the Bolsheviks took power, they immediately said, we're done fighting. They sent a message to all of the combatants, allies and Axis powers alike, saying, we're done and you should be done too. And of course, that's why the message of the Russian Revolution spread to Hungary, spread to Germany, because the workers there, they wanted to stop fighting. Millions, tens of millions had been killed. Everybody wanted the war to end except the bourgeois classes that were hoping that out of the war they'd have new colonies. The workers don't have colonies, they just wanted to stop the bleeding. That was the real reason the Russian Revolution happened.
And you mentioned that it was bloodless before.
Well, so many people in Russia and so many sectors of society were so insistent that this war come to an end. When the Bolsheviks finally staged the insurrection, the planned uprising on November 7th, the old government fell with almost, well, it wasn't bloodless, but nearly bloodless. One of perhaps the most bloodless revolutions in world history. It was in fact like a celebration. People just started drinking. They emptied the wineries. The soldiers would let all the prisoners go. The soldiers even captured the counter-revolutionaries. They said, let them go too. They said, finally, we, the workers and peasants, have taken charge. It was like a big party.
So Becker and Martin are discussing a period which is really shrouded in a lot of hazy history, where Russia was going through the turmoil of having overthrown the Tsar right after the February Revolution. And what came to power was known as the Lvov government, and originally was led by kind of a slow conservative named Georgy Lvov, who was a nobleman. He was eventually displaced by Alexander Kerensky, who was more of a moderate socialist than Lenin. And essentially, they leave out one very important event that really facilitated the October Revolution that was to come. So in July of 1917, already after the monarchy had fallen, Alexander Kerensky ordered what was to become known as the Kerensky Offensive on July 15th. And the Kerensky Offensive was a major failure. It attempted to boost morale by attacking the Germans and getting Russia back into the winning side of World War I. But instead, it just brewed even more disgruntled attitudes among the troops on the German front. So what ended up happening was that there was an alleged coup by Lavr Kornilov, one of his major generals, and instead of succeeding, it sort of was put down and betrayed. But there was no longer any confidence between the military and Kerensky. Therefore, they weren't able to combat the Bolsheviks when they attempted to come to power. Now, why were the Bolsheviks a threat as well? Under Kerensky and Lvov, Lenin had started to undermine them. He was trying to get the Soviets, which were his councils, they were his parallel government, to become the new recognized form of government in the Soviet Union. And once Kornilov's coup had failed, there was virtually nobody to protect Kerensky's government from taking power. So there was no reason it would have been a bloody revolution. There was nobody to really oppose Lenin. Kerensky had nothing to do but run away because there was nobody left to defend him.
And let's talk about what happened after the fact, Brian. Several countries invaded. How did the newfound, the revolutionaries who took power, how did they fend off the assault and use the military to do so?
That is what we call the civil war that followed the Russian Revolution. The German government, the imperialist government in Germany, demanded that Russia make huge concessions of Western territories to Germany. When the Bolsheviks under Lenin's leadership said, yes, we must make these concessions to Germany, they gave up a big part of Russian territory, which meant the territory where Russian peasants were living. Many in the left became disaffected with Lenin and the Bolsheviks and said, you're capitulating to German imperialism. We didn't make a revolution in order to give away our country. But Lenin said, we have no army. How can we fight? We must make a concession. The relationship of forces was such. And so the coalition government between the social revolutionaries, who were a peasant-led party, or a party that tried to lead the peasants, and the Bolsheviks, that alliance broke apart. And different parts of the left, along with counter-revolutionaries from the old landed estates, czarist generals, in league with imperialist invading countries, formed a common cause called White Russia. They were the whites versus the reds. And so a civil war ensued, and another 3 million Russians died. You had 14 imperialist armies invading, including the United States. You had the Germans taking up a big part of Russia. Under those pressures, it looked like the Bolsheviks would lose control. And so the white Russians began a campaign of terror and assassination. Thousands of communists were assassinated when they went to the countryside or went to the factories. So this previously bloodless revolution was suddenly engulfed in the worst kind of civil war. And all of the basic democratic premises of the revolution that had been signaled immediately starting November 7th, 1917, were replaced by conditions of civil war. When you're in conflict, when you're in military battle, hierarchies, command posts are established, and all things are done to win because you don't want to die. And so as a consequence, the Soviet democracy, the flourishing of socialist democracy, was in many ways engulfed by the military exigencies or emergencies confronting the revolution as a consequence of imperialist armies invading, czarist generals forming counter-revolutionary armies, and even left forces like SR or social revolutionaries and some Mensheviks taking up arms against the new Bolshevik government.
To say that the Bolsheviks had to engage in a civil war due to lack of support from the other factions is to ignore the goings-on of the winter of 1917 through 18. On November 25th, the Russians went to the ballot to elect a constituent assembly following the October Revolution. This led to Lenin garnering 24% behind the less extreme socialist revolutionaries under Viktor Chernov, who won 40%. He then formed a coalition with them that he quickly broke when they refused to recognize his majorities in the councils, or Soviets as they were known. He argued that the bourgeoisie had disproportionate power in the assembly, and therefore only the Soviets, which as explained earlier were even more exclusionary, should be regarded as representative. In March 1918, Lenin's Bolsheviks lost control of the municipal Soviets after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is the treaty that Becker is talking about in the previous clip. Thereafter, due to his power struggle with the socialist revolutionaries, including a failed assassination attempt against him, he would take increasingly more ruthless actions against his opponents of all political stripes. According to the Petrokhin archive, this was when Lenin said, "It is necessary secretly and urgently to prepare the terror." He then began to murder the kulaks, alleged rich peasants. The reasons they were to be hanged was not due to their wealth, but rather that the peasants had actually preferred the socialist revolutionaries over him.
Lenin was the one who understood after the February Revolution, and he alone understood this, that there had to be a second revolution. Now, most of the Bolsheviks were ready really to stop with the February Revolution and to be a left-wing lobby in the new bourgeois liberal democratic revolutionary government. Lenin came back from exile and said, no, we must have a second revolution because this revolutionary government will not break its alliance with imperialism. It will not do that which the people most need, which is to end their participation in World War I. And Lenin was bold enough and audacious enough to actually conceive of the idea that a second revolution could happen. When he came back, Lenin said, we can't have a revolution now because the masses of people don't agree with us. They're euphoric. They think the new government is something wonderful. It's not the czar. Give it a chance. In other words, he said we can't make a revolution through a conspiracy. We have to premise our tactics, our strategy on the popular will. He said you don't have to have all the people with you, but you have to have a big part of the population with you or sympathetic to you. And so he suggested to the Bolsheviks, let's stay steadfast in our principles to end our participation in the war, but go and explain persistently and patiently why that must be. As a consequence of that 6-month process, Lenin's strategy of winning over the population happened. So the Soviet, again, those councils of peasants and soldiers and workers, their composition changed by September. Instead of it being the middle class, educated parts of the population, and you know, those are the people who always get to the microphone first, they speak first, they have the privileges to be able to do that. By September, end of September, this composition of the Soviet had changed. It was poor people coming barefoot to the meetings of the Soviet, the poorest workers, the ones who were most ready to fight, those who had the most to gain and the least to lose by going for it, by actually having a revolution. They had become the new leaders within that 6 months. That was Lenin's strategic genius.
It's very easy to parse words about how brilliant of a tactician Lenin was. Ultimately, he did bring down a regime in Russia, the Kerensky government, but he wasn't the one who brought down the Tsar. That just isn't true. It was a much broader coalition of different forces that did that. And to talk about his tactics is sometimes to reveal that this isn't really somebody who's concerned about the people who are affected by his decisions. It's generally somebody who has a very long view of the future, thinks that he can sacrifice a lot in order to achieve a lot. So let's analyze some of his decisions really quickly. Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and basically, while condemning imperialism worldwide, he also committed to giving the people of Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and a number of other Russian possessions over to the same imperialist rulers. So it's very difficult for me personally to look at this person and say, well, that tactic, that's really the moral tactic that will bring about the liberation of mankind. Lenin didn't have any way of knowing that any of the people that he was conceding to the Germans and Austrians would ever be liberated. It was generally a key gamble on his part that to some extent paid off in later years when Stalin went and eventually subjugated those parts of the former Russian Empire. But ultimately, his tactics were successful in only one thing: consolidating his power in the former Russian Empire and forming the Soviet Union into a state where only the person at the top and his group of party loyalists could control an entire population. So yes, it's excellent tactics, but it's also ruthless and dictatorial tactics. And anybody who deludes you into thinking that Vladimir Lenin was some great humanitarian or leader of people because of this should really think about the results that came out of it.
And what happened when he died?
Well, he died, and if you read Lenin's writings in the last year of his living life, because he had several strokes that paralyzed him and incapacitated him, you can see that Lenin has become consumed with the problems facing this new Russian revolution. The country's too poor. The state can't provide for the peasants yet. It doesn't have enough material resources. The Bolsheviks are not equipped to really fully run the machinery, the administrative machinery of the state, so they're relying on the old civil servants of the Tsarist government. He's preoccupied with those problems, and he maybe could have guided the country as Fidel or Mao. They lived longer. They were able to guide their revolutions through various processes. Lenin, the premier, indispensable leader of the revolution, is gone 6 years later after the revolution, and the country is in crisis. It's facing internal foes, and of course, after his death, the party cleaved into different factions, those following Stalin, those following Trotsky, those following Bukharin, three big, broad factions. Lenin was able to manage a party where there was freewheeling debate, there was not censorship, people could have differences in argument. Lenin frequently lost the vote in the Politburo. He was not a dictator at all. He had no dictatorial or megalomaniacal feature. He made sure that the organization was a collective, even though it had decisive leadership. Afterwards, a lot of that spirit of leadership and the way leadership was conducted profoundly shifted, especially as the factions sort of started to fight it out following Lenin's death.
Becker and Martin jumped to Lenin's death immediately after Becker spoke about Lenin's political and strategic genius. Why did they not discuss some of his economic and administrative successes? Notwithstanding the suffering and destruction caused by the Civil War by both Lenin's Red Army and their opponents, the Whites, the USSR did not collapse as other similar communal societies did after a short period. Why? The answer is that Lenin embraced some economic policies that are anathema to the people discussing him here. The new economic policy, or NEP, was the USSR's foray into what is called state capitalism. On the national level, most heavy industry and foreign trade was strictly controlled by the government, yet under the NEP, small business owners and other entrepreneurs were allowed to flourish. The harsh grain requisitions on farmers were replaced by a tax. Notably, peasants were now allowed to sell their surplus produce freely, and small industries were permitted to establish themselves under private ownership. The policy continued until 1927, when Lenin had already died. By then, so-called nepmeni, or rich businessmen, and kulaks, well-off peasants, were seen as potential enemies of Stalin's rapid industrialization program of the country, the first of the 5-year plans. Stalin also saw the elimination of the NEP as a means to eliminate his rival Nikolai Bukharin, who was the NEP's most senior supporter left after Lenin's death. As is well known, the elimination of Bukharin, like Stalin's earlier ostracizing of the more famous Leon Trotsky, would clear all of the barriers to his most excessive crimes. The forced hunger in the Ukraine known as the Holodomor and the Great Purge of the late 1930s against his perceived enemies in the Communist Party. Becker and Martin neglect to speak about Lenin's NEP because, like Stalin, they do support collectivization of all industries, and to acknowledge its success would force them to segue into the true reasons that the Soviet Union never lived up to the promise of a truly prosperous egalitarian society.
Why did so many former prison nations of the Russian Empire end up joining the USSR?
That too was a battle between 1917 and 1922, when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was actually proclaimed during that 5-year period. In every one of the former Russian republics, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan in the Caucasus, or Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Baltics, or in the southern places, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all of these places became the point in which communists and revolutionaries were fighting it out with landlords and political elites who were aligned with one or another of the invading imperialist armies. And so by the end of the day, by the end of that civil war, which the Bolsheviks won, shockingly, because of their limited resources, wherever the working class party had the upper hand, they said, we want to be with the Soviet Union, but on the basis of mutual equality, not the old days when Russia was known as the prison house of nations under Tsarism. And thus, language rights were developed, social rights for those other non-Russian republics. And in fact, the way the Soviet government was structured, and people don't know this, is that there were two Supreme Soviets. One was the Supreme Soviet of the Union, that was of the USSR, but then there was the Soviet of the nationalities, meaning each of the nationalities had an equal vote within the Soviet of nationalities. No law could become the law of the Soviet Union unless it was also agreed to by the Soviet of nationalities, which meant smaller non-Russian republics were given essentially a veto power over laws. That meant there could not be racist laws passed against them or laws that were detrimental to their own ethnic or national development.
In this segment, there is a clear clue that these two, they're not actually conducting a fully transparent interview. It's pretty much one between two people that are of the same opinion. Why is it that Abby Martin asks why so many prison nations chose to join the Soviet Union, but Brian Becker answers that the Russian Empire was the prison house of Europe? Well, it's clear that through their shared terminology, there appears to be some sort of coordination of ideology, of narrative, and the like. Let's start with actually calling the Russian Empire the prison house of Europe. Well, in reality, it was technically the prison house of both Europe and most of Asia. But even under the oppressive rule of the Tsar, many of the traditional rulers of these subjugated countries, such as Khiva, such as Bukhara, they all had traditional leaders that pledged allegiance to the Tsar. Now, that's not exactly one of the more egalitarian or progressive structures of government, but it's not as if the Tsar forced the entire people of his empire to live under some sort of uniform rule of law. He actually delegated a fair amount of administrative power to some of the traditional leaders in the areas that he dominated.